Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a proud member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts. We continue to grow that roster at safecampaudio.org on the web, at safecampaudio on social media. We are doing our headlines week a little later in the month. Usually we do that in the first Monday. Last week, instead of our regular program, though, we featured Healing the Children of Horse Nations. If you didn't check that out, please go back and do. It is really a beautiful story that covers, everything from elders working with young people to the history, the sorry history of boarding schools in this country, and a whole bunch in between. It's really just a beautiful 1-hour program, and I will drop a link to that, plus the great reporting for the Imprint that our reporter Nancy Marie Spears, who's featured in that podcast, did alongside the podcast. So there's a podcast and a story. Listen and read. So that was last week. So headlines come now. I'm recording this on a Sunday, the halftime of the Women's National Championship game. Yours truly here. Don't share this very often. I'm a huge basketball fan, born and raised in Connecticut. So I'm a loyal devotee of the Yukon Huskies, both the men and the women. So I was bummed to see the women get bounced out in the Final Four. But, what Caitlin Clark in Iowa is doing is amazing. Dawn Staley, the coach of South Carolina, is one of my favorite players growing up. So I guess I win either way with whoever comes out of this one. And then hopefully, as you are listening to this podcast, either the men Yukon Huskies are about to go for a repeat or they've already done it. Let's go Huskies. All right, so we'll get started with headlines, do some national stuff, and then move into some local reads that have come across my radar, as well as some of the great reporting that my colleagues from the Imprint have done of late. We can start that national section with just a quick overview of what went down for children, youth, and families in the 2024 federal spending deal. So recently, I'd say in the last, the span of the last 6 weeks or so, Congress, with just hours before looming deadlines where the federal government would shut down, came to agreements on appropriations, and President Biden signed off on those. I'm going to link people in the show notes to our Youth Services Insider column about this. It's got the breakdown is just fine, but the chart is really helpful if you want to look at all of the different, broken out child welfare, juvenile justice, and family support lines in the federal budget. We've got a nice handy chart that kind of takes you through the last 5 years of funding, so you can see what's gone up, what's gone down, and what stayed the same. I'd say that the story for this year is largely level funding. You did see some pretty significant lines go down, 2 of them being the juvenile justice funding through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. There's kind of 2 main funding mechanisms that convey federal funds to the states on juvenile justice. One is called Title II. It's formula grants that go out to states in return for their complying with some core federal standards around how youth are treated in the juvenile justice system. And then a second thing called Title V, where it's just delinquency prevention funds. So those went down for the first time in a while. I know advocates are probably concerned to see that, because the hope was that after the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act was reauthorized in 2018, you might start to see, higher investments, and that those funding points start to increase. And they did for a little bit during kind of the COVID years, but we started to see kind of a downside on that one. One thing that definitely jumped out, and I think that there's been some New York Times reporting on this issue of late. I definitely think this could be kind of like a focal point issue on just youth in general in the country for 2024 is chronic absenteeism. You'll see in these spending bills, it's kind of almost like a canary in the coal mine sometimes, where it's like there's not a ton of money allocated to something, but you'll see that in the text of whatever spending bills they're putting out in the appropriations bills, Congress expressing concern over something that's kind of trending, or want to kind of force the executive branch to do more reporting or report to them on certain issues. And chronic absenteeism jumped out to me. The definition of chronic absenteeism, I believe, is missing 15 or more days in a school year, and that can be due to truancy. It could just be due to anything. It doesn't have to be, kids skipping school or anything like that. But obviously, chronic absenteeism is an issue that can, end up with families being involved either in the youth justice system or the child welfare system. So it's certainly something to watch. And what really jumps out is the Department of Education issued a report calling chronic absenteeism a, quote, hidden educational crisis in 2016. And at that point, the chronic absenteeism rate was 16%. The figure for the 2021-2022 school year was 31%. And I'm citing the numbers used by appropriators. So they're according to them, it was 31%. I think the New York Times may have had a slightly lower number, but I mean, just the fact that the Department of Education called it a hidden educational crisis before COVID, before any of this stuff happened, when it was at 16%, it's almost doubled since that time. So Congress, in this spending bill, directed the department to kind of brief all the relevant committees. I'm guessing that means the House Education and Labor and the Senate Help Committee on, and I'm quoting here, how its additional monitoring will assess applicable states' effectiveness in using chronic absenteeism as an indicator in identifying schools in need of support and improvement. So that's a lot of political speak for, we want to know how you're going to work measuring chronic absenteeism into how we're evaluating where money's going from the federal to the state. So that was certainly one that jumped out. Again, I'll link to the piece we put out because the chart's really the helpful thing if you want to kind of immerse yourself in federal spending trends. There's the chronic absenteeism. There's some new rules around unaccompanied minors and how they are handled. This is children arriving at the border without families in search of asylum. And a few kind of noticeable, like very small grants that were of interest to me. So read up on that. We'll drop the link. Same deal with this next one. We did a little bit of analysis for the Youth Services Insider column, so I will link you to it. But after a pretty noticeable delay off of the typical time that this report comes out, the federal government released the annual public AFCARS report. That's the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System, or AFCARS. Every year that report comes out, and this basically serves as sort of the year-to-year indicator of how many kids are in foster care, how many kids are entering and exiting, how many youth have been adopted out of foster care, how many are waiting for it, and of those kids who are waiting for adoption, how many have had their parents' rights terminated. And you get to look at a lot of more than that. You get to see some demographic information, the time spent on average in foster care, things like that. So what does this year's report show? And I would just say also, one thing that is kind of like hampers this AFCARS report is that it generally tacks about a year behind. Now we're about a year and a half behind. So this report just came out and it covers fiscal 2022. Of course, we are in calendar year 2024, so that feels a little dated, but 2022, we're well past now the, real core of the COVID social isolation standpoint. So the 2022 report, of course, is going to give you a little bit of a look at, okay, we're past, the social isolation that kind of kept kids out of school and kept them out of the eyes of a lot of, adult professionals that would otherwise be in their life. What's going on. And what we find here in the 2022 AFCARS report is that the number of kids in foster care continues to go down. We are now at 368,530 youth in foster care, 6% fewer than 2021, 16% fewer than 2018, which I believe was the most recent peak for youth in foster care. If it was 2017 or 2018, I can't remember off the top of my head. This drop has been fueled by a very steep decline in entries into foster care, which most states are experiencing. There are some states that, between 21 and 2022 saw some pretty significant spikes. I think Georgia's one of them. Louisiana is definitely one of them. New Hampshire, Delaware. There might be another one that I'm missing. But the vast majority of states have really continued to see a precipitous drop in entries into foster care. And that has more than offset the fact that exits from the system are slowing down. And they continue to slow down. So, if it was just a factor of exits, we'd be seeing, foster care get clogged up. But in fact, just the lack of kids entering foster care has really been the sole driver of this number coming down for several years in a row now. More further good news, I guess, would be that we at the Imprint, through our Who Cares project, ask states in a much more recent fashion how many youth are in foster care. I would not hold ourselves out to be as scientific or buttoned up in terms of process as the AFCARS report, but we do try to capture a point in time count every year. We peg ours to March 31st of each year. So when we're doing our Who Cares survey of states, we ask everybody how many youth were in foster care. So we have a 2023 figure, and that number suggests that there is a downward trend that will continue in 2023, and I think that you will see for when the AFCARS report for 2023 comes out, which will probably be around this time next year. I think that'll back up what we've found, and so we'll continue to try and get a year ahead of the feds. Not because it's like competition or anything. It's it is what it is with AFCARS. It's going to be delayed, so we try to get some more recent indicator up. But all those things are kind of trending in the right direction. So you can check out our subscriber column at Youth Services Insider for a little bit more in-depth analysis on this stuff, and you can get links in that write-up to where you can go and find your state breakouts and all that stuff. I will say just a couple of things that are worth noting here, kind of in the interior of the AFCARS report. The average time in foster care has gone up, and that really isn't surprising when you factor in first that entries are going down, which I think at some level you have to assume is correlated to less kids who really didn't need to be in foster care being in there, that would have maybe spent, a couple of weeks in foster care and then gone right out. But more importantly, when you see the exits start to slow, which they have been doing, of course, the average time in foster care is going to go up. I think the more concerning thing, though, is I think around 2016, 2017, we saw the reunification rate from foster care dip below the 50% mark for the first time since AFCARS has been tracking that. That is down again. So that was like 49%, I think, that year. Now it's all the way down to 46%. So just to kind of sum up the annual federal data on child welfare stuff, which, if you want to combine this AFCARS report to the child maltreatment report, which came out just kind of before the year's end, which we have already talked about on this podcast. But really, just in summary, overall foster care is down, fueled by way less entries, overcoming slowed exits. The number of substantiated victims of abuse and neglect are at record lows. So that's all good news. On the bad news side, the number of children who died of maltreatment has increased every year for, I think, the last 5 calendar years. So again, I'll drop links for people that want to go to the AFCARS report, our write-up, and all of that in our show notes. We have talked a few times on this podcast about President Biden's new finalized rule around kinship caregivers, and specifically how states can go about licensing and approving them. The rule that the Biden administration finalized basically makes it known throughout the country in every state that you are allowed to create an alternative path to license relative caregivers, and those relatives who are licensed are entitled to equal allotments or allocations of federal foster care funds as any other foster parent would be. And quickly after the Biden administration kind of put that rule forth, even when it was in the kind of interim stage and had not yet become finalized, advocates for kinship caregivers began to develop and have circulated, model standards that states could use to create that alternative path that would make things easier for relatives to get licensed while making sure that, homes were still full of people who are safe to care for kids. And the headline here is that in the last month or so, the first state and the first Native American tribe have been approved for their alternative licensing path under this new rule. So basically the way it works is you just have to submit kind of like a revision, I think, to your 4E plan. 4E is the foster care, the child welfare entitlement that, covers foster care and adoption subsidies as well as prevention services. So you have to just submit a plan to the feds who, once it's approved, then you're good to go. The licensing is sanctioned and then you can start to, get reimbursement from the feds for foster care payments. And so Michigan has become the first state to get approved under this process. And the Salt River Pima tribe of Arizona is the first tribe to get it. Now, my understanding from talking to some folks close to, this campaign to proliferate the model standards and such is that there are a lot of states who have already moved towards developing their plan and are waiting on approval. There's a whole bunch of other states that are interested and moving a little slower, but still plan to move towards developing an alternative path for kinship caregivers. And just a few states, really a handful, that have not really expressed any interest in kind of playing ball and working on this stuff. So, we'll continue to keep our eye on this as, more states move towards this. But it is a fairly big development. And Michigan wins the race to be first, along with the Salt River Pima tribe. All right, one more national thing before we take a little break, and then we'll come back with some local news and stuff. Just wanted to call out this very helpful resource. It was done by a state office, the Office of the Colorado Child Protection Ombudsman, but it is a 50-state mandated reporting law database, and I'm sure they will continue to update this. They cover, 7 different specific questions that I'll kind of bundle into like a few themes here about mandatory reporting policies around the country. So the first thing they looked at was just time frame. What time frame is given for mandatory reporting requirements in different state statutes. They looked at the scope of mandates. Do mandated reporters who are bound by their professional capacity have to report on things, outside of their job? There's a couple that deal with intermediaries, like do statutes, enable or prohibit an institution like a school or a hospital from having their own mandatory reporting policies, and then also whether or not, reporting something up to a supervisor would suffice for mandated reporters, or whether that they're really required, to direct it to a hotline or something like that. They looked at medical neglect. Do statutes include medical neglect in their definitions of child abuse and or neglect? And then a few on training, particularly one about implicit bias, diversity, equity, inclusion, and then more broadly, whether or not statutes address training requirements for mandatory reporters. So the link is kind of an easy one to remember: coloradocpio.org/mandated-reporting-resource. Don't worry if you would rather just go to the show notes. I will drop a hyperlink there for you. But obviously, mandated reporting, kind of a front and center issue right now in child welfare, and they have done a really good job to start compiling this. I'm sure they'll be updating it because, as you'll see with some of these maps, there's definitely a lot of, gray colored states where it says, information not available. So I'm sure once more people know that this is out there, I find from our experience trying to map stuff at the imprint, once you've got the map out there, people see it, they're going to want to help and chime in from their state with, hey, I know the answer to this. And so I have no doubt that that's going to get better quickly over time. All right, we'll take a quick break and come back with some local headlines.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
All right, so let's take look at some local headlines in child welfare and youth justice, along with, an opportunity for me to call out some of the great reporting that our guys here at the Imprint are doing. We're going to start in Tennessee, where the Tennessee Lookout reports on a new bill called the Tennessee Foster and Adoptive Parent Protection Act that would prohibit the state's child welfare agency from excluding parents who have moral or religious objections to an LGBTQ identity and want to foster or adopt a child in state custody. The bill does, basically allow DCS, the Department of Children's Services in Tennessee, to take a child's feelings into account before placing them into a family's home, but it does not require the agency to do that. So really kind of case by case, probably based on the caseworker, I guess, that could be enforced or it could not be, where you're asking the child to what they feel here. Why this jumped out to me is because it really seemed from the reporting like this was this bill taken directly to basically take direct aim at something that the Biden administration has, offered up as a proposed rule for, covering all of child welfare basically through federal policy. And that is to establish, a requirement that state child welfare agencies implement, and I'm quoting from the policy here, specific processes and requirements, end quote, to ensure that youth who identify as LGBTQ are in safe and appropriate foster homes or other placements. Now, what does that mean for a placement to be safe and appropriate? The rule says that means an environment free of hostility, mistreatment, or abuse based on the child's status. The provider of these safe and appropriate options must route youth to supportive resources. Now, one kind of obvious challenge with the structure of the Biden proposed rule is that it's not like kids walk around, even older ones, with LGBTQI status printed on some badge or a t-shirt that they're wearing. So it's impossible to know everybody that this would apply to. But the proposed rule from the feds tries to get at this by requiring a safe place for any youth who proactively request it. And, more broadly requires that systems notify at least all children 14 or older of the availability of safe placement. So if the section of that Tennessee bill that says, it wouldn't preclude DCS from taking a child's feelings into account, I guess that maybe kind of lines up a little bit with the federal policy, but certainly the spirit of the law kind of is in direct conflict with what the Biden administration is trying to do. And Tennessee has been among the states that has kind of like, corralled a bunch of people to push back against this rule. I think the bigger takeaway for me is like we're on this and in other aspects of litigation and legislating careening towards kind of a reckoning on sort of the legal meaning of things like being affirming or being safe, and really what the difference is between beliefs and ideology and projection of beliefs and ideology. Just to put it into kind of a blunt term, is it possible that a foster parent or foster family or relative caregivers who believe, whether it's based on their religious beliefs or any others, that they just disagree with an LGBTQ lifestyle, is that just in and of itself disqualifying of them for caring for that youth, even if they're pretty adamant that that is not going to impact how they love the person or treat the person or care for the person? It's just simply the fact that they believe something disqualifying of them as, in the federal parlance from this rule, safe and appropriate or not. And like I said, this is one example. We have a couple of lawsuits circulating through courts right now. One is in Massachusetts. I think there's one in Washington State and one in Oregon, where you have, potential foster parents who have been pretty clear that they are not going to, let their beliefs about LGBTQ lifestyles or transgender youth and the seeking of gender affirming care, they were not going to let that get in the way of caring for kids, but were not willing to kind of disavow their own belief system. And so we'll see where those go. My personal view, I think that this is going to end up in the Supreme Court sometime soon. Tends to be the case when you have a whole lot of different federal circuit courts taking on the same issue. So this is something to watch for sure. So the state of Idaho will be launching an investigation into conditions at congregate care facilities, residential care facilities in the state. And that is all with credit due to our colleagues at Investigate West, who did a really bang-up job exposing some really scary stuff happening at one of their providers, where several former workers at this place called Cornerstone, basically banded together and sent their concerns to the state. One of them was fired summarily right after that. I want to read why this was a really good story and great reporting by Investigate West. So I'll drop some links for people that want to read up on this. But I wanted to read this particular part because it jumped out to me, and I think it says something. I don't know what really entirely yet, but I'm just going to read these paragraphs to you. In an interview with Investigative West, Jim Smith, who I'll just add parenthetically is the owner of this congregate care facility, Cornerstone Cottage, Jim Smith acknowledged that in hindsight, not everything has gone perfectly well at Cornerstone, which is, again, parenthetically, a huge understatement. There was, a rape at this place. There were lots of well-documented cases of physical abuse. The police were coming almost on like a weekly basis there. But he stressed that he and his team have always done their best to care for girls with severe behavioral issues. He maintained that all employees are trained to handle dangerous situations and claimed that the state's repeated findings indicating otherwise were merely Cornerstone's record-keeping errors. In fact, Smith took the state's lack of enforcement as evidence that Cornerstone was doing something right. And this is a quote from Smith. Certainly, they would have taken away our license, or they would have sanctioned us or done something had they felt that any of the major concerns were a problem, but that never happened. I think reading it again right now, what's really scary about that comment is just this sense that this owner, who kind of admittedly really had no experience doing this before he started this program up. I mean, it was like a senior living center for a little bit, and then he just changed business models. But just that fact that, well, I assumed we were pretty good on average because the state didn't do anything to us, really says something about the state of monitoring these congregate care facilities. That he just assumed, well, if everybody else was doing so much better, we would definitely have gotten shut down. And the fact that we didn't get shut down, even though they knew about this or that, serious incident here, means we're probably above average. I mean, that is kind of a scary thing. So anyway, I'll drop links, and congrats to the Investigate West team who did this. It was really great reporting. And kind of in a similar vein, I want to link people to our staff here at the Imprint's great reporting on a new comptroller report that came out of New York, and it found, very serious and concerning upticks in negative incidents, very bad concerning incidents in New York's secure juvenile facilities. So this was done by the comptroller, who examined this period of time. It's like a 5-year window between 2018 and 2023. They were looking at incidents that occurred with a select number of youth at 6 of these juvenile secure sites, which don't include New York City because New York City runs their own. So according to this comptroller's report, self-harm episodes in New York secure facilities rose 100% between 2018 and 2023. The, quote, expression or gesture of suicide rose 667%, growing in number from 3 incidents in 2018 to 23 incidents in 2023. And I won't spoil the story for you. You should read it's not a long read, but it is an impactful one. But, one of the culprits here that's kind of teased out is staff shortages, is not having enough workers to safely operate facilities. And that's the thing that really travels, outside of this story and outside of the state, is that, I'm old enough and have covered juvenile justice long enough to remember the days when one of the big problems was you had these training schools, very large juvenile secure facilities, where there were so many kids that it wasn't safe. And now it's really just the fact that there's not enough staff. You could have a relatively low number of kids, but just the inability of the staff to, on a day-to-day basis, keep them safe is the new capacity issue, right? It used to be just how many kids were inside the walls. Now it's just how many workers are inside the walls. in a lot of places, because this is certainly not just a New York problem. We have spoken before on this podcast about the African American Family Preservation Act, which is a piece of novel legislation out of Minnesota that's been, in the hopper a few times in the last few years, and would in some ways sort of mimic the protections of the Indian Child Welfare Act for Black families in Minnesota. This is not an exhaustive list of what it would do, but it would actually bring, active efforts, which is kind of the standard in ICWA for Native American families, to African American families in Minnesota. It would make it more difficult or more procedurally onerous to terminate the parental rights of Black parents. And what I want to do is link folks in our show notes to reporting on this that our reporter in Minnesota, Alex Perez, has recently produced, because in a recent hearing on the African American Family Preservation Act, a sort of substitute bill was put in that would require, active efforts to prevent family separation for any child, and I'm quoting now from this substitute language, whose race, culture, ethnicity, disability status, or low-income socioeconomic status is disproportionately encountered, engaged, or identified in the child welfare system as compared to the representation in the state's total child population. So this language was very specific in previous iterations as to be only for Black families. This is obviously an enormous widening of the scope of this. And, basically there was some discussion at the hearing about the fact that that definition of disproportionately encountered children and families would account for about 90% of the kids who are involved in the child welfare system at any time. If that is true, then were this law to pass, it is just my opinion, there's just no way that they would substitute a different standard or anything different for the kids that weren't actually covered by that definition. So if you just look at the disproportionality index that like the National Center on Juvenile Justice does, I think probably the only groups that would not be counted towards these active efforts in the state of Minnesota would be, middle and upper class white children and Asian children. I don't think that they're going to keep a different standard for those kids if this actually became law. So you should read the entire story. This is really interesting. A lot of eyes are on this bill, not only just in Minnesota. One other thing I wanted to note here is that I think about a month or so before this hearing, where the nature of this bill language was changed to kind of have a more expansive view of disproportionality, two groups, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, and the New York-based advocacy group Children's Rights, asked the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to investigate the state of Minnesota. And I'm just going to read from the complaint, which very specifically is about patterns of, alleged discrimination against Black children and families. And here's what the complaint says. The discriminatory and disproportionate removal of Black children from their families comes at a heavy cost to both children and parents. The state has failed to remedy the historic and ongoing harms caused by its child welfare system, and the discrimination against and disparate impacts upon Minnesota's Black families have been egregious and shocking. So I'll drop our reporting both on what's going on with this legislation and details about this, pursuit of a federal investigation into Minnesota for you in the show notes. All right, home stretch here. Just want to call out two great stories that our Jeremy Loudenbeck, or one of our California reporters, put together. One is an interview that he did with Latifah Simon, who has spent her career advocating for and leading investments into community strategies to support children and families in California. She was the founder of the Young Women's Freedom Center. She is now running for Congress. And Jeremy sat down to talk about the run for Congress and her career, which has included, as I mentioned, founding the Freedom Center and working in philanthropy. She'll always have a special place in my heart because Latifah was one of the first people who I interviewed when I was a very young reporter. I did a profile of her when I was at Youth Today. She couldn't have been nicer. I didn't know anything about what I was talking about at the time. Maybe I can go try and scare that interview up and drop it in the show notes next to Jeremy's, because I just remember her being, even just as a young leader, somebody where you're just like, that person's going to go places. So that place might end up being Capitol Hill. We'll see. And then Jeremy also wrote a really great obituary commemorating the life of Barry Chrisberg, who is one of the greatest juvenile justice researchers that this country has ever seen. He passed away recently at the age of 78, and the piece that Jeremy put together really kind of does a very good job of encompassing, why Barry was such a effective criminologist and reformer on top of just being a researcher. He was the head of the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, which is now called Evident Change, for a very long time. And like I mentioned, he did pass away in February at the age of 78. One quote from the story that really got to me, Bart Lubow, who used to be at the Annie Casey Foundation, said of Barry, he was someone who had the unique ability to tell people they were being jerks without losing them. And that did resonate. He was a funny guy, salty at times, but very straightforward and super helpful to me as a young reporter just trying to figure out what was what in the world of juvenile justice back at that point. So rest in peace to Barry. My condolences to his family here. And for folks that weren't lucky enough to know Barry or know of him, do read that obituary. You'll get a nice little look into what made him very effective and great in this sphere. All right, that's going to do it for this week. Thank you guys for listening. Go Huskies. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCampAudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. We would really appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.